good evening and welcome to Works in Process. I'm Caroline Cronson, Special Events, and we're delighted to have Pacific Northwest Ballet return and do another, what will be wonderful show on the real Petipa. Because we're so sold out, we're live streaming all over the world. So we should all say hello to Carla, Körbes' family in Brazil. Anyway, I'd like to introduce you to the wonderful Peter Bowl, Artistic Director.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I'm here to introduce Doug. I will say that when I took the position of Artistic Director at Pacific Northwest Ballet, I was talking with friends and saying, you know, I'm really not a stager, really not a choreographer. I don't know if I can do this job. And my friend said, I hope you can hire well. And I did. I hired Doug Fullington, and he's terrific. He's been by my side my time at Pacific Northwest Ballet. And Doug is actually much more than my assistant. He's also the director of our education programs and really makes that a vibrant part of who P&B is today. Doug, as you may know, is a reader of Stepanov notation from the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that gives us a window into what Petipa had originally created and how that may or may not have changed over time. So I'd like to introduce Doug. Doug, we're so pleased to hear this lecture, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and of course an honor to be involved with this great company. We're here tonight to talk about the term After Petipa and what that means. Really, the majority of 19th century ballets presented today are presented with the choreography attributed to After Petipa. And what does that mean? Of course, it can mean several things. First, it can mean that the choreography is based on original choreography by Petipa. Second, it can mean that the choreography is based on Petipa's choreography based on someone else's choreography. Third, it can mean that it is essentially what we might call school of Petipa or in the style of Petipa, even if it is a dance that was created after Petipa retired in 1904, and there are a number of cases like that too. But most importantly, it means that the choreography isn't completely what Petipa originally did. Now, can we get back to what Petipa originally did? Probably not, but we can get a little bit closer to it and find out a little bit more of how he worked as a choreographer, what his style was like, what his intentions were, and that's what we're trying to do tonight. Now, it was also common practice in the 19th century to adapt another's choreography, and Petipa did this quite a bit, particularly with the Parisian ballets that were brought to St. Petersburg. Giselle, Paquita, Le Corsaire, Coppelia are four examples, and there are others. Petipa's choreography was also staged by others during his lifetime, most notably by Alexander Gorsky in Moscow, and not always to Petipa's liking at all, as we read in his memoirs. He's not very happy about a number of changes that were made to his stagings during the end of his career. So we'll be looking at three famous duets tonight and looking at a version that's as close as we've been able to get at the present time to what we think Petipa may have seen. And then we'll also be looking at a more traditional After Petipa version of that choreography. And the three duets are the Bluebird Pas de deux from the third act of Sleeping Beauty, the so-called Black Swan Pas de deux from Swan Lake, and also the Wedding Pas de deux for Aurora and Prince Desiree from the third act of the Sleeping Beauty. So for the older version, the version that is as close as we can get, we have used the Stepanov notations that are housed at the Harvard Theater Collection, and I'll be talking more about them as we go along. But we've used those to put together the older version of the choreography. And for the After Petipa version, our dancers have put together a version of each of the pas de deux that includes elements of the variety of traditional versions that are being performed today. So we'll see these side by side, and we'll discuss how they're different, what has changed. We'll suggest some dates that the changes may have occurred, the best that we know. And I'll also suggest some reasons as to why the choreography may have changed, some reasons more obvious than others. And really informing all of these versions tonight are the important stagings that were done in England for the Vic Wells Ballet in the 1930s by Nikolai Sergeyev, who worked under Petipa as ballet master and used the same Stepanov notations for his stagings that we've been able to use tonight. So we'll be starting with the Bluebird pas de deux from the Sleeping Beauty, which I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with. And we'll be looking at the After Petipa version first. But with each of these, let's start with the music, because the music and changes made to the music really informed the choreography in the first place. Bluebird pas de deux, of course, choreographed for the premiere of Sleeping Beauty in 1890. It was originally intended as a pas de quatre for two couples, the Bluebird and Princess Florian, and Cinderella and Prince Charming. Now we know that by the time the premiere came about in January 1890, Petipa had split the couples apart, and the Bluebird and Florian got the entire dance for themselves as a pas de deux. Cinderella and her prince got their own music and were off on another dance. So that was a change that was made already before the premiere. In many of today's performances, the two dancers are both referred to as bluebirds, but that wasn't the case. The fairy tale goes that there was a prince who was changed into a bluebird, and in this particular pas, his intent is to teach Princess Florian how to fly. So we see a number of flying references in the choreography, and that brings us to the choreography itself. Is it all by Petipa? Maybe, maybe not. The original bluebird was Enrico Cicchetti, the great Italian dancer and teacher from Italy. It's possible that Cicchetti choreographed his own variation, his own entrances in the Coda. And we don't know what else he may have choreographed. It was not uncommon for the men to offer their own variations, as we'll see with the Black Swan pas de deux. So already questions, even talking about the premiere. Now, a couple of things to watch for in this After Petipa version that we'll see first. Notice the bird-like quality of the choreography and even of the hands. You'll see the fluttering of the hands of Princess Florian, the waving of the arms like wings by the bluebird. Also, give note to the pace or the tempo of the music and how it sometimes changes to accommodate the amount of movement required by the choreography, particularly at the end. Okay, that's a whole mouthful, and it's time to look at some dance. So we're going to be seeing Leta Biasucci and James Moore, joined by Christina Siemens at the piano, in this After Petipa version of the Adagio of the Bluebird pas de deux. That dance has an exciting finish as he lifts her up to his shoulder in that flying pose. It's as though she's achieved and learned at that point. You can hear how the music needed to accommodate the length of time that her leg is in développé, the amount of time to get up to the shoulder and so forth. There's quite a bit of slowing down to accommodate that. That's one thing that we'll find in After Petipa versions, is that steps that were changed, steps that were elongated because dancers' technique was stronger or different. Changing aesthetics sometimes requires that the music tempo also be changed to accommodate those choreographic changes. We're now going to look at the same pas de deux that we reconstructed from the Stepanov notations that were made for this dance, we think right around 1903, which is about 13 years after the premiere of Sleeping Beauty, so not so long after the premiere. These dances were notated in what's called the Stepanov system, developed by Vladimir Stepanov in the early 1890s. It was a system of notation used just at the Imperial Ballet in St. Petersburg from the early 1890s on into the early 1900s. These notations, as we know, were brought west by Nikolai Sergeyev after the revolution in Russia. He used them to stage dances for Paris Opera Ballet in Riga, and most notably for the Vic Wells, Sadler's Wells Royal Ballet in London. They're now housed at the Harvard Theatre Collection, where scholars and really anyone can have access to them. You'll notice as you watch this dance some differences between what we've just seen. There are some differences in partnering. I find that the partnering in the older versions is a little bit more sculptural, with the way the man partners the woman and in the way there is a juxtaposition and balance between the two, the way the arms are held, the way there's opposition between the man and the woman. You'll see that the lifts are different. There are fewer overhead lifts in the older style. There are more lifts to the side. You'll see a point where Jerome will lift Sarah and walk her back upstage, whereas Jerome lifted Leta overhead. Jerome has Sarah on his side. This was a common lift. We actually even see Balanchine use it in the Adagio of Theme and Variations. The timing of the music is different. Here the tempo is faster. We have the metronome markings from the conductor's score in St. Petersburg in 1890. Generally, we find the tempos to be faster, which informs how the dance is performed. And of course, occasionally we see complete differences between steps in various passages of the dance. So now we will see Sarah Ricard Orza and Jerome Tisserand perform the same dance, the Adagio from the Bluebird pas de deux from the notated score. The man's variation is famous, of course. Cicchetti was the original Bluebird. It has wonderful references to flying in it. Interesting to know that in 1890, as far as we know from the musical scores, the music was cut and was about half the length of the variation as it's performed today, which the men find a sort of welcome change. Only one hard diagonal at the beginning. We're only going to show you the notated version because it bears so much similarity to the After Petipa version. This variation has stayed well intact choreographically despite the opening up of the cut in the music and the repeat of the opening steps to the other side. There are about 3 combinations of music here, and really only the second one is a little bit different. I'm going to have Jerome just demonstrate this, Jerome, if you will. Usually the man performs tour jetés across the stage, but here we have a step. It's a step I've not seen before notation. It's a little bit like a kind of backward temps de flèche. Just give it a go there. There's a nice flying quality to it. A little bit different from the regular tour jeté. But other than that, quite similar. So Jerome, we're going to go ahead and have you dance this for us. Thank you. I do want to say that I don't think the cut in the music had anything to do with the stamina of the dancer. I think it had to do quite a bit with the fact that by the time Petipa was getting on to the 3rd act of Sleeping Beauty, he realized he had a very, very long ballet on his hands. And there were numerous cuts made in the score, beginning with the 2nd act, the hunt scene, on through to the end of the ballet, and notes by Petipa referring to, this is too long, and so forth, in his own notes. We're now going to look at the Princess Florian variation and to really point up the differences and how the variation has evolved over the years. We're going to have Leta and Sarah perform the version side by side so that you can see them together. Now, interesting to note that there is not much bird-like choreography for Princess Florian, which I think makes sense. She's the human one of the couple. You'll see that the variations are quite similar in ground plan, but the older variation, perhaps simpler, perhaps a little bit more musically rhythmic. The After Petipa version has a much greater amount of detail and less repetition of the same steps. You'll see that after Leta performs her opening step 2 times, she moves on to a different step, whereas Sarah will perform her opening step 6 times, 3 times to each side, right, left, and so forth. Now, perhaps the older version seems simpler because of the limitations of the notation. That's something that certainly needs to be taken into account. But just looking at the steps, which are clearly notated, we do find greater simplicity in the older version. But again, as I say, perhaps greater rhythmic clarity because of that. You can decide, though, because you'll see them side by side. You'll see Sarah on your left dancing the notated version, Leta on your right dancing the common After Petipa version. So similar, really, but very different in detail. Just years of change over the years, different things added, details added, and all that accrues, and the variation becomes a different piece. We'll now look at the Coda of the Bluebird pas de deux, and again, we'll only show you the notated version as we did with the man's variation, because we found that what was notated and what is usually performed today is quite similar. The end is wonderful. We see the triumphant Florian finally fly off the stage, the Bluebird in happy pursuit. Also watch the opening combination for the man, the famous brise volées, the battery beats to the front and the back, 12 times each. We have bourrées for both the man and the woman. That's unusual, I found in the notation, to have bourrées for the man, but we have that in unison for both dancers. Also, at the end of the dance, Florian makes a circle around the Bluebird before she runs and leaps off the stage, and I find that quite a bit in the notation, the woman circling the man, almost as though she's orbiting around him, if you will. She's either running around him, she's bourring around him in a circle, she's active while he stands in the center. Find that in a number of dances. We'll see it later in the pas de deux for the Prince and Aurora from the Sleeping Beauty. But now let's watch Jerome and Sarah in the Coda from the Bluebird Pas. Let's move on now to the Black Swan pas de deux from the third act of Swan Lake. And of all the dances on the program, this certainly has the most complicated history, beginning right away with the music, which was composed for the 1877 premiere in Moscow. We know that the music originally was intended as a pas de deux for two merrymakers in Act 1 of the ballet in 1877. When Petipa and Ivanov came to restage the entire ballet in 1895, they wanted a pas de deux for Odile, von Rothbart's daughter, and Siegfried in Act 3, and there wasn't one. There was a pas de six that may have involved Odile, but would also have involved the princesses who were candidates for the prince's hand. So they transferred that pas de deux from Act 1 to Act 3 and began fashioning what was then a traditional pas de deux for a man and a woman. They rearranged quite a bit of the music because as Tchaikovsky had composed it, one movement would segue into the other. So there wasn't really a final cadence or final ending for the discrete pieces. They all segued into the next with a musical transition, which was quite clever of Tchaikovsky. But Petipa and company wanted something a little bit clearer, something they were a little more used to. So right away, the music had some surgery done to it. Some music was taken out, some music was added. The variation for Odile is a piano piece by Tchaikovsky that was orchestrated by the conductor, Ricard Rodrigo. It is a sort of salon style. It sounds different from the Tchaikovsky of the 1870s. It sounds a little bit more like Drigo around 1900, if you're familiar with those styles of music. But nevertheless, they were successful in creating a pas de deux in 1895. Now, Petipa didn't refer to this dance as a pas de deux. He referred to it as a pas de quatre demi d'action, a dance for 4 people that was half action. Now, who were the other people? Well, Odile and Prince Siegfried, von Rothbard, Odile's father, who is also referred to as an evil genie in the program. And then there was a second cavalier who was danced by Alexander Gorsky. He's nameless, and in the notation, he dances the male variation. Now, in 1895, he may have taken part in the Adagio as well. That's not indicated in the notation, but these notations were made about 10 years after 1895. So a lot of unanswered questions still, but nevertheless, we can get a little bit closer to what we think really happened in 1895. You'll see in the choreography for Odile that there are no overt swan impressions. Odile wasn't referred to as a Black Swan until about the 1940s. She was referred to as an enchantress, and in fact, her costume generally was a multicolored costume, sort of a fantastic-looking costume. We know Janet Reed, in fact, wore yellow when she was Odile with San Francisco Ballet, and the roles of Odette Odile were danced by 2 different women at that point in time, although they were danced by the same woman in 1895, as well as in 1877, for the record. Notice the interaction in the older version of the Adagio between Odile and von Rothbard. She's continually going over to him, asking him, what happens now? He'll tell her just to be quiet and go back dancing, or you're doing excellently, and so forth. They have a variety of interaction, while Siegfried, I mean, he must be under a trance, and she must have been a good enchantress, because he apparently doesn't notice all of this. Also notice the really unique partnering combinations. There's some really unusual ones here, particularly at the end, where she's holding a penché arabesque on point, holding both of the prince's hands while he's on his knee. The last minute, she lets go and grabs his knee. It brings her face quite close to his. It's very unique, something I've not seen in the rest of the notations, and very fun to see and to be able to put back together again. So we're first going to see this opening dance, the Entree and the Adagio, from the Black Swan pas de deux, as notated around 1906, performed by Carla Körbes with Seth Orza and joined by James Moore as von Rothbard. A lot of tricky partnering there. If you look at photos of partnering from the period, lots of one-handed partnering too, kind of amazing things where the woman's quite far from the man. He's holding with one hand as she balances and is bent backward and so forth. So there was a lot of well-developed partnering back at that time. I forgot to mention the vision of Odette that you know appears halfway through this dance as Odile is seeking to enchant Siegfried. Odette appears in a vision to him, and of course Odile doesn't want him to see, so you could see the point where Carla was blocking Seth's eyes. She'd bourre backwards, turn around and block his eyes several times while von Rothbart moves upstage to erase the vision of Odette. Now we'll look at the After Petipa version of this same pas de deux, which is often, as you know, performed as a concert piece on galas and so forth, out of context of the complete ballet. And that is how we'll show it tonight, even to point up further the differences between these two versions. So there will be no von Rothbart and no vision, really, as well. The ballerina in a performance setting would be wearing a black tutu. The choreography has come to include overt swan impressions, including a quotation of Odette's choreography from the Act 2 White Swan pas de deux, where she is on the ground and leans up to see Siegfried. Odile's movements have become very sharp, really to point up the difference in her character, her sort of sly, evil, wily character, as opposed to Odette's soft plastic movements. And as I think we saw in the After Petipa version of the Bluebird pas de deux, there is a great deal of coordinated detail between the man and the woman here. We can see very well worked out timing of not only the basic partnering, but of movements of the head, movements of the hands, arms, and legs, and so forth. Very well worked out. All of these changes that have accrued over time and become codified as the After Petipa version of this pas de deux. So we'll see Leta Biasucci and James Moore in this After Petipa version of the Black Swan, Entree, and Adagio. So I'd say maybe, while the architecture of Petipa's dance from the notation is still very clearly there, the content, about 50% changed, maybe even a little bit more than that. Now that dance is exciting and wonderful in and of itself, but it certainly does represent a change, and a change over time from what we have notated just 10 years after Petipa choreographed that dance. Now we come to the male variation. Again, many changes and many differences here. As I mentioned, in 1895, Alexander Gorsky was a second cavalier in this, what we now call Black Swan dance. He danced the male variation. Now, in 1899, Gorsky published notation of this particular variation in his samples of Stepanov notation. It's one of the few variations, one of the few dances that was published, actually typeset and published, in the Stepanov method. Now, was this the dance that he danced 4 years before in 1895? We can't be sure. I'd say it's probably likely that he choreographed his own dance in 95 and danced it. It's performed to a B-flat major waltz, which was part of the original Act 1 pas de deux in 1877, but it's not a piece of music that's used in most Swan Lakes today. And the choreography is something that is now lost from the repertory as well. When you watch Jerome dance it, you might think, well, that looks just like Bournonville, and it certainly does. It's definitely in the French style of petite allegro dancing, which was the norm for male variations in St. Petersburg in the latter half of the 19th century. Notice how he never stops moving. Always small jumps, beats, turns, and so forth. Never the big step and then the run or the walk to the next position to start the next combination. Everything is linked with steps, non-stop, beginning to end. So we'll see Jerome in this variation choreographed by Alexander Gorsky. The most common After Petipa variation for Prince Siegfried, now danced today, is attributed to the Russian dancer Vakhtang Chabukiani and likely dates for the 1940s. Chabukiani, as we now know, was responsible for choreographing many of the most considered classic male variations in the repertory today. He first danced the role of Siegfried in 1930 when he was just 20 years old. This variation is set to up-tempo music that Tchaikovsky originally composed in 1877 to follow the Adagio in this pas de deux. It was cut in 1895, but eventually reinstated for this more large-scale, more bravura-looking and sounding variation for Prince Siegfried. And this is a really classic example of a mid-century grand allegro variation for a man, and it really points up one of the biggest differences I find in working with the Stepanov notation between male variations then and now. The male variations at that time, as I've said, were petite allegro, small jumps, small beats, constantly moving. Those developed in the 20th century into grand allegro variations with larger jumps, bigger beats, more turns, double tours, and so forth. So we will see James Moore dance the After Petipa variation for Prince Siegfried from the Black Swan pas. So not only were two completely different pieces of music presented there, but completely different choreography. The variation that James just danced bears no resemblance to what Jerome danced. It's interesting reading in the histories now, this is still such a developing area. There are suggestions that perhaps the Siegfried variation now is based on the Gorski variation, which is often said was just a very small, brief variation. But as we can see, so far, no resemblance at all. Again, such different styles in male dancing from the 19th to the 20th century with regard to this ballet. We're going to move on to the Odile variation now, and a very different story for the women. We find that the female variations have changed far less than the male variations, which is so interesting. I'm not really certain of the reason, but there is an anecdote of Petipa talking to one of his ballerinas, Ekaterina Vazem. She was the first Nikia in Bayadere. She was the first Paquita in Petipa's big changes to that ballet in the 1880s. And she was going to take on a role in a full-length ballet that was made famous by another dancer, and she didn't want to dance the variation that was associated so famously with that other dancer. She just thought it was aesthetically not pleasing. She wanted to do something else, and Petipa said, "You know, dear, if you don't dance it, they'll think you can't dance it." So perhaps that's a reason that the women's variations have changed far less. But we'll see not so many differences in the Odile variations. As I said, the Odile variation was set to a piece of piano music by Tchaikovsky that Ricardo Drigo orchestrated. It was one of several pieces that were interpolated into the 1895 score to bring it more into compliance with the way Petipa liked to structure a ballet, and Drigo was responsible for orchestrating those piano pieces. We'll see the notated version first, danced by Carla Körbes. Again, no swan references here, and a lot of repetition of phrases. The opening combination of movements is repeated 4 times. Notice the final manège. It's a series of turns. It goes straight through the music to bring Odile all the way around the stage in a series of turns. In that sense, with regard to the amount of material, it's quite a simple and straightforward variation. So we'll see Carla dance that, followed by the After Petipa version. Comparing the older variation for Odile with the After Petipa version will be similar to comparing the two variations for Princess Florine. The two are quite similar. They share a similar floor plan. They share similar structure. But we'll see in the After Petipa version for Odile just greater development in the material. After two opening combinations, two repeated opening combinations, you'll see Leta move into a new combination. There was sort of less patience for repeating a combination 4 times. Perhaps 2 is enough, and we need to move on to something else. We need to change the direction. We need to change the step, and so forth. The manège involves a greater variety of turns. It's essentially a more developed version of what you just saw Carla perform. Also, again, as I mentioned with Odile, the movements are sharper. The characterization of Odile is to be found more in the choreography. Perhaps this has to do with the fact that mime and dance balanced each other more evenly in the 19th century. In the 20th century, with the excision of so much mime, the characterization was going more completely into the dance, and that was the place that the stagers, the choreographers, were wanting the characterization of the dancer and of the role to come out. Just a thought there, something I'm still thinking through as I work with these different versions and see them side by side. Let's watch Leta dance the After Petipa version of Odile's variation. So now we come to the famous Coda, which of course is famous because of the 32 fouettes that Odile performs. And these were performed in 1895, as we know, by Pierina Legnani, the great Italian dancer who danced for a number of years in St. Petersburg. She was a great technician, worked brilliantly on points. She was said to have steel points, as many of the Italian ballerinas were said to have. She introduced the fouettes in 1893, in Petipa's production of Cinderella, not a ballet that stayed in the repertory, but she found a permanent home for them in Swan Lake, a real ideal place for them with the character of Odile, who really is triumphing over Siegfried at this point. She has him in her grasp. And there's really, I think, nothing like those fouettes that really shows that she's achieved that authority and power over him. In fact, I believe the audience was so thrilled by them at the premiere that they made her repeat them. Apparently she didn't do quite as many, but just the fact that she got out and did it again is really something. We're only going to show you the After Petipa version for a couple of reasons. The notated version only has choreography for Odile, no choreography for Siegfried. So we'd have a lot of blank spaces unless we made something up, which isn't the intent of what we're trying to do. The 32 fouettes are notated. There are 2 fouettes notated, then times 16 next to it, which gives you 32. Most of the combinations, the succeeding combinations of steps for Odile are the same in the notation, except where you'll see Leta perform releves and arabesque as she travels upstage. At that point, the notation has échappés for Odile. The final movement is a supported double pirouette with Siegfried. Those are differences with the After Petipa version, but beyond that, quite similar. So we will see Leta and James perform the After Petipa version of the Coda from the Black Swan pas de deux. We'll move on now to the Act 3 pas de deux for the Princess Aurora and Prince Desiree from The Sleeping Beauty. And as with the music for the other two pas de deux we've looked at, there are a lot of complications early on with this number. Tchaikovsky composed the set of pieces as a pas de deux originally for Aurora and the Prince, but by the time the premiere came about, Petipa had taken other music out of the act, namely for the Gold Fairy, her music had gone on to Act 2, and the Sapphire Fairy, whose music was in 5/8, got cut. So these two fairies were added to this set of dances, and it became a pas de quatre. Now, the fairies never dance with Aurora and her prince, but they do have a dance. They had a dance after the Adagio, and we don't know how long this stayed in the repertory, but it's in the original program. We're not even exactly sure what music the fairies danced to, but we'll get to that in order. But as you can see, each of these dances has a confused history right from the beginning. I love this Adagio. This has really been one of my favorites to work on because I usually think of The Sleeping Beauty as of course, such a wonderful piece, but less character development, if you will, for the princess and her prince, or a less obvious sort of development to put over to the audience, something that the dancer must really work on and must really put forward through the choreography. Here in the notated version, we see a great intimacy between the two dancers, which I was so pleased to see. Not only do they mime phrases to each other, I love you and will dance with you, and she finally says, I love this one, I love you, and I will make you my husband. They also embrace one another, whereas today we have a penché arabesque, which is beautiful, that the princess holds, supported by the prince. Here they simply embrace each other, and I love the simple intimacy of that. We'll find in these two dances that the floor plans are quite similar, but again, the content is different. Sometimes more difficult in the After Petipa version, sometimes more unique in the notated version. One famous element of the Adagio are the fish dives performed towards the end, where Aurora performs 2 pirouettes and dives into her partner's arms. These apparently were not in the 1890 version. Neither are they in the notation. She performs 2 pirouettes, and her leg goes up into ala seconde and comes down, and she moves on. We believe the fish dives were added for the 1921 London production produced by Diaghilev for his Ballet Russe. We know that not all the ballerinas wanted to add those to the dance. Some were willing, some were not. This dance also is what we would call a pas d'action, or a dance with action, because of the pantomime between the 2 dancers. It balances out the other acts in the Sleeping Beauty. If you know the ballet, there's the wonderful pas d'action in the prologue where the fairies give the gifts to the Princess Aurora. In Act 1, the pas d'action is the Rose Adagio, where the 4 suitors court the Princess Aurora. In the second act, the pas d'action is the vision scene, where the prince is shown the vision of Aurora and falls in love with her and seeks her and she's always just out of his grasp, and he's kept from her by the lilac fairy. And so all of the acts are balanced by making this pas de deux really a pas d'action, where the princess and the prince declare their love for each other and their intent to marry. We're not going to show the dances side by side here. We're going to go straight through the older version, and I'll talk about each number, and then we'll move on to the After Petipa version. So dancing in the notated version, we have Sarah and Jerome as the prince and princess. Things get a little confusing after the Adagio. The program of the original production tells us that the fairies of gold and sapphires performed a dance. The notation says they performed a dance in 6/8. The only 6/8 number is the Entree music that preceded the Adagio, which is cut, scratched out of most of the scores that we know were associated with the first production. So what music did these fairies dance to? Well, I think it was the Entree music. And in addition to that, the notation is about as unclear as some of the notation gets. It looks straightforward, but then as someone in a different hand has written numbers 1, 2, and 3 in different places to suggest it maybe isn't notated in the right order. This is the best guess of what the fairies danced after the Adagio in 1890. And we'll be seeing Leta and Carla as the fairies of gold and sapphires. Thank you. We come now to the variation for Prince Desiree. The notated version, so interesting. We know that Pavel Gert was the prince in 1890. By the time the notation came to be notated around 1903, it was as performed by Nikolai Legat, of course, the two Legat brothers who were really hot shots in the company in St. Petersburg, taking over from the older generation, joined by a couple of their colleagues, including Alexander Gorsky. This is to me, a very unusual variation, and almost a transitional one, in that it shows perhaps the beginning of the transition from the Petit Allegro style to the Grand Allegro style. This variation has everything but the kitchen sink in it. It has a manège of jetés. It has brise volées. It has double tours followed by a jeté. It has just about everything. We can see in today's versions vestiges of this variation, but I've never seen this variation in performance, and we thank Jerome Tisserand in advance for taking it on. So here is the Prince Desiree variation as notated around 1903. may come as no surprise that the variation for Aurora is quite similar to what we see today. We've put together the variation as notated, will be performed by Sarah Ricard Orza. Coming to the coda, the notation, just as for Black Swan, includes no steps for the man, and for quite some time, I mistakenly thought that Aurora danced the entire coda. In fact, I know, Alexei, I told you that. I was wrong. Guilty. Because earlier in the notation, right after Aurora's variation, there's Legat's name, which indicates that he would have danced at that point, but no steps. I thought there were enough steps from Aurora to fill the music, but once we realized that there were no cuts in the coda, according to the scores from 1890 and around that time, we realized that the prince must have danced the first 4 8 counts, the first 4 phrases or iterations of the melody, and then Aurora would enter. So we only have notation for Aurora, so we're simply going to have Christina play the opening rather than create some editorial steps for Jerome, who's worked quite hard tonight. And Sarah will join us on that 5th 8, and Jerome will join her, and we'll finish out the coda as notated. Now, the After Petipa version of this pas de deux is strictly a pas de deux, no fairies of gold and sapphires. And like most dances on the program, it's come down to us in the West through the version that was staged for the Vic Wells Ballet, on down through the Royal Ballet, also informed by the many dancers who had come out of Russia before or just after the revolution. And as we know, changes were occurring in the Soviet Union as well, from early on to these dances, and all these changes started to merge when there was more interaction between the East and the West. As dancers came out of Russia to the West, they brought their changes from the Soviet versions, and the After Petipa versions now have become a little bit of a melting pot of all this accrual of change. But we do find Petipa's architecture still there. It has lasted. It's still strong. It's still recognized as such wonderful architecture for dance. But the content, the steps, we see changed. Partnering has changed. Level of difficulty has grown, just as we see it growing in athletics as well. Aesthetics change over time. The male is presented in a more bravura style. The woman, the female, presented still as the ballerina with the emphasis on the point work. A couple notes about what you're about to see here. You'll see the fish dives reinstated. We think, as I said, those came in about 1921. The variation for the prince generally is the one that was choreographed, we believe, by Konstantin Sergeyev for the 1952 Sleeping Beauty for the Kirov, one of the very standard variations for the prince performed now. We're going to let this pas de deux be danced in its entirety, the Adagio variations and Coda. You'll be seeing Carla Körbes with Seth Orza. And before they dance, I want to thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thank Mrs. Mary Cronson for hosting us once again. It's been a delight to be here. Please enjoy the pas de deux from Sleeping Beauty.